Paul, I wanted to make a quick response to your video. First of all, I thought it was amazing. I really did. I particularly just want to congratulate you on laying out what I think is a very clear argument and a very clear idea and answer to the problem. And I think it's a perfect example of how, in most instances, we can agree with the bread and butter and disagree on the periphery. And I think that's most cases, actually, and it's never framed like that. And I also think if the goal is to have some fruitful and profitable conversations, a lot of the energy should be spent understanding where the other perspective is coming from and speaking to that perspective so that you're persuading rather than just pontificating. And there's so much of that. First of all, the approach that this Muslim or this group of Muslims took in the idea of the rose, and then the thoughtful and, by the way, very well articulated and very well written letter. I think that's just amazing. I think that's personal. I think that cuts through all the hyperbolic nonsense and the miscommunications. And although there are people that will disagree with substance, there's a lot in that letter that, nobody disagrees with. And one of my frustrations is that there's an assumption. There's an assumption that to not agree in lockstep with that means that you're somehow hospitable to the nucleus of the message. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. The biggest differential that I think I have in my mind from, say, the argument that you laid out is where the onus is at, where the focus is at. Oftentimes, when I talk to my liberal friends, particularly about the issue of Islam and the outcropping in society that comes from that faith group, it seems to trigger within the liberal mind some sort of a knee-jerk reaction within the liberal mind. And I think I'm putting my finger on it when I say this. The liberal mind is focused on power structure, stronger, weaker, so on and so forth. That seems to always be the way they framework things or the way they see the world. So in this instance, when a terrorist attack happens, Paul, people that think more like you, people that sort of drift more that way, the first thought you're going to think, or maybe not the first thought, but a very quick thought that you're going to think is, how are the rest of the people who aren't Muslims going to start treating Muslims? In other words, things like Islamophobia, fear of Islam, immediately is going to trigger your mind, and you're going to worry about this. You see this in various political personalities and stuff in their rhetoric. And I'll just say that this frustrates people like me because there's a baked-in assumption about this that isn't true. So the assumption is that because there's a terrorist attack in London, there's this whole host of people, I'm sure I would be included in this gaggle of people because of my politics. We're going to grab pitchforks, we're going to grab stones, and then we're going to head out for brown people to just persecute. And that's an extreme version, but I think something like that rolls through the liberal mind. Well, that's just fundamentally not true. And I would argue that America has a great track record of that not being true. Yes, there are major problems with race, major problems in our history with religious integration, all that stuff. But that's on one side of the scale. The other side of the scale is immense success, especially when you compare it to everywhere else on the planet. The melting pot has actually succeeded. I know that there are fringes. I know that there are examples of anything you want there to be, vice versa. But largely that's true. So the instinct that the West or the white man or the other or the predominant or the majority or however you want to phrase that, I think the liberal just thinks of that in realm of just like power and not power, or numbers and not numbers, or political influence and not political influence, or however you want to look at that. I don't think that bears out, especially when you look at the majority of instances, but it's a huge fear of the liberal mind. It's a huge trigger. Like, they're just worried about that. Juxtapose that thinking with my thinking. When I see Islamic terror ping the media radar, and I agree wholeheartedly with you that the media is despicable, that they carry an enormous amount of division, water, and misinformation, and I don't know why at this point people of every political stripe don't literally rise up and destroy the media. That's how venomous and horrible and despicable they are. So if they happen to be your flavor of chewing gum that day, they're not going to be tomorrow because they're horrible, despicable entities of lies and perversions of the truth. But that's a rabbit trail. People of my persuasion hear Islam ping the radar and we're thinking, this is a problem with this ideology. This is a problem with these ideas. I'm always thinking ideas. That's what it is. It's ideology, it's ideas. It's not people, it's not shades of skin, it's not others, it's not who I'm afraid of. It's good ideas versus bad ideas. That's all I think about politically. I'm very, very frustrated with the left always hoisting other things onto me. And I'm saying this so there's clarity of thinking between the two of us. I get very frustrated when I want to talk about ideas, and I feel as though the liberal is littering the highway of discussing those ideas with the shrapnel and the glass and the nails of accusation and alternative motives, which do not exist in the lion's share of instances from people who think like me. And I know that's very hard to understand for the liberal, because they are literally marinated in this thinking that we're all just racists and bigots and homophobes and xenophobes, and we don't like the other, and we just want to preserve and protect. It's not true. Of course there are those people, and I would sadly remind you, there will always be, from now till man no longer walks the planet, there will always be said people. But this is almost such an outlier as to not even be worth discussion. I know the liberal doesn't agree with me, but I really think that way. And so the liberal is always thinking, in my perspective, blame the powerful first. Blame America first. Blame the West first. Blame the exterior oppressive circumstances that must have caused this ugly behavior. And that's not where I put my focus, because I think that's foolhardy. I put my focus on the ideas, the center. Think of it as a cancer. It's not necessarily untrue that when the liberal points out all these symptoms of that cancer, that they're not symptoms. I'm not saying they're not symptoms. For example, Paul probably would like to put your attention on something like the economic circumstances, or, what would you think if somebody was bombing your country? Which, to be intellectually honest, it's not as though those things don't have any influence on this. Of course they do. And a thoughtful person has to recognize that these are ingredients in the pot. They're symptoms of the problem. But what a conservative like me gets frustrated about, Paul, is shouldn't we focus on the calcified cancer before we're putting Band-Aids on everything else? It's a very frustrating thing. And moreover, this is why I can't trust liberals with foreign policy, even though the GOP makes me sick too. I do think there's a hawkish nature to the GOP that's unnecessary. I do think there's a military-industrial complex. I was in the military. I've been to all these places. I've been to Israel. I've been to the Gaza Strip. I've been to Iraq. I've been to Afghanistan. I've been to Turkey. I've been to Bahrain. I've been to these places. I've walked the sand. I've talked to these people. These aren't just arbitrary thoughts. But when I have a liberal that is not able to identify the cancer, I don't want that doctor operating on the patient, right? The conservative mind is listening to this. And although I like to think myself thoughtful enough to understand what you're saying, it's like changing the window dressings in a burning house. And it's a frustration for the conservative, because if you're not recognizing there's a cancer, if you're not recognizing the house is on fire, you can't be in charge. Because even if you have interesting thoughts on the window dressing or color of the wall or the color of the carpet, until we identify the problem, which is ideology. The problem here is the present form of Islam, or at least the popularized and politicized form of Islam, which definitely gets the most noise, which definitely gets the most action. This notion of a minority within Islam is very, very stretched at best. I would encourage everybody to check out a video by Ben Shapiro that lays out that the minority of Islam argument is a myth. It's a myth by number. It's a myth by math.
Islam teaches peace. Muslims the world over aspire to live with dignity and a sense of justice.
1 billion people, you say. All these billion people don't hold any of these don't hold these pernicious beliefs?
No,
I would.
Well, they don't.
But even if you reject that, we're still talking about millions and millions of Muslims. That is a problem at the heartbeat of Islam, and that needs to be addressed. And one more thing, in order to address it, air needs to be breathed into that room. In order to address it, society, global society, needs to be able to speak openly about said problem without all of the booby traps rhetorically and the accusations that exist, and everybody knows they exist. For example, if somebody like me gets on television and we say the problem is in the present form and the present teaching and the present popularized and certainly media megaphoned example of Islam, which is generating huge traction online, generating huge action, ideologically moving the needle. If we can't address that, if we can't speak of that without being slandered into oblivion, we can't make any headway. I have seen moderate Muslims go on television. I've seen them address the actual issue with tremendous courage, I might add, because literally they could have their head removed from their shoulders or their family exterminated. The Don Lemons of the world are like, how dare you say that? That reeks of truth. We can't have truth here on CNN. We like to blow PC hot smoke up your bungholio 24/7 here at CNN. This is what conservatives are frustrated about. I think there is a very watertight analogy to be made between the problems that plague African American culture in America and the problems that plague Islam right now. The problem is that there is huge noise, huge money, huge conversation spent about the external problems affecting Islam. There's rivers of commentary about this. They're poor. The West is evil. America has a strong military. There's carpet bombing. There's drones, all of which is applicable conversation. But one thing you're not allowed to say is the problem is at the nucleus of Islam and the way it's being pushed out to the world. Can't say it. Therefore, can't heal it, can't fix it, can't diagnose it. Christians had to go through Reformation, and we certainly didn't do that by everybody just dancing around the elephant in the room. Christianity dealt with that with flaming pulpits, rebuking all this nonsense. Read your history. That needs to happen to Islam, and it can't happen if you can't discuss the problem. The exact same thing can be said about the African American community. How much noise is out there? Black Lives Matter noise, hands up, don't shoot. Complete nonsense. Cops maybe shooting 20 people a year, which is very real, and I don't agree with any of that. In fact, I'm very, very suspect of the police. But come on, the problem is in that culture. We have a failure to understand the value of education. We have a family unit problem in that culture. 70% of the fathers are MIA. These are obvious problems. And if somebody cared about the community and didn't just want to pat themselves in the back or feel peacock proud about having the right PC talking points, but actually cared about the community, they would address that. But every African American that addresses that, from Ben Carson to Clarence Thomas, they are literally lynched by way of our social media platforms. It's ridiculous. The same is true if you can't speak truth, if nobody can say what's actually true, and instead you got the Al Sharptons and the Jesse Jacksons of Islam being the only ones with the mouthpieces, the problem will calcify. The problem will calcify. Basically, the African Americans are losing 20, 30 lives, sometimes a week in Chicago, because you can't speak of black-on-black crime, which is actually the threat to African Americans in this country, or at least the most predominant and deadly threat. Same thing with Islam. You know who kills more Muslims than anybody? You know who tortures more Muslims than anybody? Outcropping of Islam, the politicization of Islam. Do you know what persecutes more women, more homosexuals? Islam, the outcropping of Islam. But you can't say it. You have to say it's socioeconomic. Or there's a drone that wrongfully murders an innocent. Yes, these things are horrible. They're horrible. But it's urinating in the ocean of the real problem. And most of those outskirt problems, most of those subsidiary problems would not exist if we dealt with the cancer. Paul, I loved your video. I love the fact that you opened the door to this conversation, and I hope many more jump on it. Because this right here is how you actually communicate to one another. What I'm offering you is when the conservative mind hears what you said, it's not that we disagree with the fundamentals of it. We disagree with where you want to put the focal point, the laser pointer, and that's it. Because everything else, I think there's a lot of agreement on. Great video, Paul. Well done. Thank you for giving me the chance to respond to it. Take care.